Um, Today we're going to talk a little bit about the Russian flu epidemic of the 1890s, and perhaps think a little bit about how that compares to COVID-19 today. I was just thinking, COVID-19 seems a long, long time ago. We're now in 2021, 2 years on. So there's a lot of ground to cover. And we'll talk about the pandemic. We'll talk about the princes who got the disease, politicians who caught the disease, possibly identify even a super spreader event, and why the post office had the finger of blame pointed at them. Incorrectly, I have to say, but let us go on. So just a few words first about the post office itself. The post office is, Royal Mail, it was known, is nothing new. But in the 19th century, it really expanded its operations, particularly after the introduction of the penny black, which meant that you could send a standard letter anywhere in the country for the price of 1 penny. And that was a huge change in the way it operated. And it generated a tremendous increase in the volume of mail, and also improved literacy rates. This expansion of the system was focused really around London, and this painting, which dates from 1854, of the General Post Office in London, right next to St Paul's, just shows you the centrality of the post office as a really important 19th century institution. And you can see the hustle and bustle that was going on around it at the time. Well, as I said, the introduction of the penny black, which came around about the 1840s, really began to impact on the volume of letters and also the literacy rates. This graph shows you the literacy rates from way back in the 17th century. This is women, and this blue here, this line here, is female literacy, and male literacy, which had really been pretty stable all the way through from the 18th century into the middle of the 19th century, also began to improve very dramatically with the growth of the male. Obviously from 1870 onwards and the introduction of primary education, that was improved, but the really big increase had already started prior to that, and it was linked up to this expansion of letter writing that was introduced after 1840. So the post office was really important. It touched everybody's lives, and it was an incredibly significant institution. It was also a very big employer. It was a nationwide organization, and it had around about 167,000 employees in 1900. The map on the right-hand side is actually something that some of the U3A volunteers have helped transcribe. It actually shows you the distribution of post offices and the proportion of sick employees. Forget about the sickness for the time being, but the dots represent where each of the major post offices were. It stretched from right in the north up here, north of Scotland, all the way down to Cornwall here and to the far reaches of Ireland, which was part of the UK at the time. So it really was an important national institution that linked up the entire country. And it included a really wide range of occupations: letter carriers, postmen, sorters, right up to the Postmaster General, all of which focused on London. And about a third of the mail of the entire country came through London and was sorted there and then redistributed through what became the rail network from the 1840s onwards. So this is what happened. The mail came into to London. This is on the left-hand side, the 6 p.m. rush, last mail. It had to be sorted, and then if it was for delivery outside the capital, it then had to be loaded onto trains, which became known as the travelling post office, which then left at 8 p.m. from the major stations in London and travelled overnight whilst letters were being sorted by hand on the rail carriages. It was said that if you posted a letter at 6 p.m. in London, it could be delivered at 8 a.m. in Glasgow the following day. So there's first class post for you. It kind of runs today's Royal Mail, a pretty good race. So this is what happened after 6, and everybody was, a lot of the sorters were involved in working at night in quite cramped conditions, as you can see, right next to each other for long hours of time. And these were the railway wagons. The railway had been introduced into Britain in the 1830s. The network expanded very rapidly, particularly in the second half of the 19th century. And these characters here on the right-hand side were the kind of workers that would have been sorting mail overnight on the way to any number of towns in the rest of the country. You can see some of the mail bags there. Yeah. Just to give you a sense of that rail network, and you'll realize why this is important when we come on to the pandemic side of things. This is a slide from some research being undertaken by Cambridge University, the Centre for Study of Population. This is the rail network in 1851. There's London. You can see it's linked up to all the major towns: Bristol, Birmingham, Nottingham, into the Midlands, in the Northwest, Manchester, and so on. I'm afraid they didn't map Scotland, so I haven't got Scotland, and I haven't got the Irish railways. By 1881, that network really reached all the way into some of the most rural parts of the country, even into Snowdonia, North Wales, all the way down into Cornwall. There was very few small towns that were not accessible by train, and most villages were within a short ride, a horse ride, of the nearest rail network. If you want to read about the impact of the railway on a rural village, Larkrise to Candleford, it gives you a really good sense of the coming of the railway and the impact on mail. By 1914, the network had expanded to around about 20,000 miles. It was much larger than it is today, and trains were working on the network all the way through day and night. Oops. And that meant that even small places, this is I never know how to pronounce this. Wymondham, it's not pronounced that way. This is in Norfolk. Even relatively small villages had their own post office. This is the post office there in 1903, and you can see the number of post offices expanding very rapidly as the rail network expanded as well. So there were around about 20,000 post offices by the 1890s or thereabouts around the country. And so on to the pandemic. The Russian flu is coming. And news started to emerge late 1889 and into 1890, round about January time, of a strange illness that was striking down people overnight, large numbers of people, spreading over from Russia. There's some dispute about where it originated from. Some people consider that it was originated in China, others in Russia. But the first reports started to come through from Russia. This is one of those reports from a newspaper called The Standard of 3rd of January in 1890, and it talks about how Lord Lytton and his son Lord Nebworth and so on, the aristocracy, people who were well connected, are now laid up with influenza, and the Russian ambassador Baron Morainheim is suffering from a severe attack. Of course, this was the middle of winter as well, which is important, as we know, for the current COVID situation. So maps such as these began to appear in the newspaper. You could see the flu advancing on a day-by-day, month-by-month, day-by-day basis. And by January, it had emerged in London, and it began to spread through the rest of the country. I'm going to try and play this. This is actually an animation
of the spread of the flu. So let's hope it's going to play. This gives you a sense of, let's go. Here we go. It's about a minute long. This is how the flu actually spread. This is October 1889. This is November 1889. Second half of November. December, beginning to appear in Europe. Spreading into the UK and France and Spain by early January. And then from there, it began to spread to the east coast of the United States, down to South Africa, parts of South America by March. By April, it had reached New Zealand and Australia, India, Southeast Asia, Japan. And I think that's as far as it got. No, there we go. A year later, August, September 1890, spread back into China. Oops, let's just close that and go back to my presentation. So it was a, let's just see if I can, oops. So the flu came, it spread, it was noted in each of the European cities. This map shows you from December through into January. By January, these are the cities where it had started to appear. There's London, and it began to appear. There's Edinburgh, and then by the second half of January, early February, in the UK, it was pretty widespread. There were reports in Bristol, in Dublin, up in Edinburgh, and around the northwest. So it was a flu that seemed to move from east to west. And what was noted was that it spread first into the capital cities, and then from there into the surrounding countryside. So the thought was that it actually spread by by lines of communication. And given that London was the centre of the post, suspicion began to fall on the post as a vehicle for transmitting the disease. It appeared first in London and then to the places where London was connected to. That was the reason why there was that fear. Don't forget, the concept of a virus was unknown at the time. They didn't really understand how something like influenza was being spread. Well, the response was a bit similar today, actually. New hospitals, field hospitals were set up in Paris. You can see this. This is from a Parisian newspaper. There's one of the field hospitals, a bit like the, I suppose, not quite like the Nightingale hospitals. But you can see inside tents, temporary structures, and people being presented here for diagnoses. On the right-hand side, this was the kind of a Belgian newspaper. This was the dance of death. There's the influenza coming, and everybody is in line for it. Nobody quite knew what to do with it, what medicine to take. These are the medicines that are being touted to stop the flu, which of course they didn't. We'll come on to those quack medicines a bit later. Well, suspicion fell on the post. This is the central telegraph room in the General Post Office. And in 1890, at the start of 1890, about a third of the workers in this branch of the post office were off sick with flu. The thought then was that these people were in contact with the post, and don't forget that letters were building up, were coming into the General Post Office, were being stored, sorted, then returned to be distributed around the capital or around the rest of the country. These people would come in contact with the mail. So the very high rates of sickness in the General Post Office focused attention on the mail as the vehicle of spread. But curiously enough, when you looked at the postmen, the people who actually delivered the mail, many of whom would have been working outdoors, the instance of disease in the postman, as opposed to these telegraph and indoor workers, was much lower. So one or two astute doctors noted that, but they couldn't explain it. And we now know, of course, that viruses are spread through close contact in poorly ventilated places. If you're working outdoors, you're less likely to get it, which was the reason why postmen got it far less frequently than did indoor workers like sorters or telegraph workers. So the flu knocked off around about, or laid off about a third of the indoor workers in London, but it also attacked those who had lots of contact, politicians and members of the aristocracy. We've already seen that in an earlier slide. And here is the poor Duke of Clarence, Queen Victoria's grandson, second in line to the throne, who caught the virus and died, even though he was a young man of 28 or so. And politicians, including the Prime Minister, and don't forget our own Prime Minister, also managed to catch COVID. But in those days, Lord Salisbury also caught the disease, and it took him several weeks to recuperate. Even 6 or 7 weeks after it was said that he'd caught the disease, he was having to spend time at the seaside to take in some fresh air. So he had long-term effects of catching the influenza. So politicians caught it, princes caught it, indoor workers caught it. But in fact, that first wave was only one of several. This is the death rate per million of influenza from the 1850s up to 1890. This very sharp increase here shows you that first wave between 1889 and 1890, but as you'll see, throughout the 1890s, there were other waves. A wave in 1892 and a wave towards the end of that decade. So it came and went and it came and went, and gradually it eventually disappeared, but it was a long time. It hung around a long time, which is why you get these kind of images appearing 2 years after the first outbreaks in London. This was a very common cartoon, and it was making the point that the influenza fiend attacked those aged 1 year, and actually this shows you aged 80 years. There's the young baby, influenza, no hope, and the old man on the left-hand side. The dance of death touched all of them equally. Even if you follow the influenza through the newspapers, you start to pick up the outbreaks of these events. This is from the Western Gazette of the 1st of March 1895, and it makes the point, the article points out that Lord Rosebery, this is Lord Rosebery here, caught the flu, but so too did all of these MPs. They're all leading politicians. These three here are all Somerset MPs. They all caught the flu at the same time, and I'm really interested to try and track the movements of these people in the weeks leading up to the 1st of March to see whether either they attended the same event, possibly in Somerset, where they're MPs, or possibly were members of the same club, the Gentlemen's Club in London, equally stuffy to the Inland Telegraph Office that I showed you. So all of these politicians caught the influenza sometime in the weeks leading up to the 1st of March, and these three in particular were all MPs of neighbouring constituencies. So was there a super spreader event? And of course, nobody knew how to deal with the flu. There were all sorts of quack remedies. This was the advert for a carbolic smoke ball, which was said to cure influenza. And the carbolic smoke ball company challenged anybody who would use this to demonstrate that it didn't stop them getting the flu. In other words, if they took this, they would be immune from the flu. One of the women who bought their carbolic smoke ball did catch the flu and sued them and won. And the case that proved they were negligent in that their claim was false. The company refused to pay. They said £1,000. They refused to pay. They were forced. They lost the case. They were forced to pay. This case is still used today as a casebook example of false advertising in law degrees today. They weren't the only quack medicines. There are all sorts, Turkish baths, steam baths, you name it. Any kind of pill or potion was suggested as being influential, but it wasn't, of course. And the reason why it wasn't was really because nobody knew what a virus was. The concept of virus was unknown until some Russian scientists discovered it in the 1890s when they were researching tobacco blight. But it actually wasn't until 1900 that the first human virus, it was yellow fever, was identified. From then, work continued to identify human viruses, but really because they couldn't be detected, it was very difficult to identify them. So it wasn't until the 1930s, after the first electron microscope had been developed, that people were able to see the virus. And in 1933, very soon after the discovery of the electron microscope, the virus actually causing influenza was isolated. And just to show you how new our knowledge of virus, what a virus is, in 1960, which is within most of our living memories, Peter Medawar was awarded the Nobel Prize for Medicine for his discovery that viruses actually comprise pieces of nucleic acid, DNA or RNA, that were wrapped up in the protein molecules. And this is obviously a familiar image now of a coronavirus, taken from a very interesting article by the Wellcome, who are our funders, about visualizing viruses. So it was not surprising, given the lack of knowledge of how disease was spread and no knowledge of viruses at all, that most treatments of influenza didn't work, other than really isolation and rest. So let me wrap all of this up, and let's just cast a brief thought about COVID-19, we've heard so much about. The 1890s Russian flu was the first flu pandemic for over 50 years. So most doctors didn't know about pandemic flu. They had no real understanding of how it was caused. They also noted that no class was spared. So postmen, telegraphists, as well as princes and politicians all caught the disease. So it wasn't a disease of poverty like some diseases were. And it seemed to spread through overcrowded workplaces, as well as stuffy gentlemen's clubs, and also amongst key workers, people who had lots of contact with other people. There were no agreements about how to cure it and how to treat it, which allowed all sorts of quack medicines to proliferate. And one only has to think back to President Trump's, I hesitate to use that word, early advocacy of bleach as a treatment for COVID. So the parallels today are quite striking, I think. Even the suggestion that by some virologists that the Russian flu of the 1890s was actually a coronavirus that spread first from animals to humans. So the Russian flu, which was a global pandemic, it had key workers attacked, princes, prime ministers, politicians, even presidents have been infected. Quack medicines were peddled. The disease affected millions of people. If you take the number of deaths from the Russian flu in Britain in the 1890s, and you ramp it up to represent the population today, there are about 250,000 deaths in the 1890s from influenza in Britain. That gives you some sense of the scale of that particular pandemic. So unfortunately, we're back in the present. We're in the middle of a pandemic, but perhaps that gives us even better reasons to start looking at the health of workers in the past. And I hope you've enjoyed hearing about the pandemic, the Russian flu pandemic, that is, of the 1890s. Thank you very much for listening.